I decided to introduce gender in 2001. And it was because I was utterly frustrated and voicing on behalf of so many women in the UN meetings in Marrakesh the huge frustration about being excluded from decision making and it being excluded from major positions of power, major offices and roles that were being elected.
I think people are just really comfortable with the status quo. My attitude is, why not me? Like, we need more people who feel like that, otherwise no change is going to be made. I'm a first-year PhD student at Cambridge University, looking at the application of AI to climate change issues. Specifically, I'm using acoustics, machine learning, and Indigenous knowledge in regards to forest conservation. Women's experiences with climate change are so different because women usually uphold the community and they give care to the community. So if that community is harmed by drought, by hurricanes, by flooding, they are the ones at the forefront, piecing the logistics together and supporting the whole community from the effects of climate change.
We have to include women in decision-making because they have the expertise on the ground, they know exactly how it affects them and the community, and they can bring the solution and another perspective. Friendship is an NGO from Bangladesh that Runa funded 20 years ago. I can see the direct impact it has on the most vulnerable in education, in health, in climate adaptation, in gender equality. It's amazing when you see that millions of people are impacted by the work she does.
So Friendship has been working with the most vulnerable climate-impacted migrants or IDPs. Bangladesh is in the forefront of climate impact, and the people that we have been working with are those migratory communities. We have been working for healthcare because that's what you need to address when people are suffering. Climate action, so that, with agriculture, with indigenous knowledge, so that as they migrate, they can stand back on their feet again. This was the most important thing to give to them. It was not a choice that we work with women, but when a cyclone strikes, when floods come in, it is those, the old, the women and children who are the left behind. Women are so often portrayed as victims. They needed not quicksand, but a platform on which to stand.
If we open up the definition of what it means to be a leader, we can get rid of this victim label that gets put onto people and actually see that those people are also leaders.
When I look at the forest protection movement, when I look at community organizations, when I look at amazing projects that are helping protect forests, the vast majority are led by women. Let's start with having at least 50% of all negotiations, climate negotiating teams be women, and that at least a portion of those women are indigenous.
Alipunja. Mi nombre es Verónica Imunda. Soy quichua de Ecuador. Represento a la Confederación de Nacionalidades Indígenas de la Amazonía Ecuatoriana. El ser mujer es muy complicado desde cada una de las cosmovisión de las nacionalidades. Para que una mujer esté al frente necesita luchar primeramente con su propia cosmovisión, porque en cada cultura las mujeres siempre hemos estado no visibles. Prácticamente desde las mujeres que han luchado desde diferentes espacios, es muy importante la inclusión, porque vemos mujeres lideresas desde algunas nacionalidades que han destacado, y sobre todo ahora tenemos también mujeres en espacios grandes como parlamentarias en mi país, Miriam Cisneros. Entonces nosotros solo estamos siguiendo ese sueño de las mujeres, como jóvenes, como mujeres, decir que no vamos a dejar así, sola a nuestra Pachamama. Vamos a seguir desde cualquier rincón de Cuenca Sagrada, vamos a estar acá como mujeres de lucha. Para mí es muy triste porque estamos tocando puertas ahora, pero puertas para salvar la misma humanidad. Y es muy triste porque el cambio climático nos afecta mucho a nosotros. No solo a nosotros, al mundo entero está afectando.
If you look at the theme of biodiversity, for example, if you look at just where are all the species on planet Earth, what we find is that 80% of all of the remaining biodiversity on planet Earth is on indigenous territories. And that half of the world's intact forests are on indigenous lands as well. And then so you ask, well, why is that? It's no coincidence. For example, I'm in a forest walking with an indigenous person, woman or man. Maybe that person is in their 40s. They know more than 500 species of plants, how to use it, where they grow, what it's good for, when they can hunt certain animals, when they can't, the patterns of the rain, the patterns of the weather. They are scientists.
One of the biggest themes in my research is redefining this distinction of what science is and what expertise is. And often, even when we're trying to be positive and say, let's include local people, let's include different cultures, let's include traditional knowledge or indigenous knowledge, there's still an othering of that knowledge being separate to the science. Whereas what I'm trying to get across is that indigenous knowledge is science. It's a process. Science is a process. Expertise is a process. It's a knowing. It's hypothesizing. It's creating solutions. And so they're not separate things. They're one and the same. Effective decision making is really having an understanding of who has expertise, and expertise not being seen as something that is institutionalized, whether that's with the university or with a political party, but expertise through lived experience, expertise through understanding, through tradition, through culture.
Effective decision making for me means that, first of all, the people who are affected by a decision take part in making that decision. So nothing about us without us is a phrase that was coined by the disability movement activists, and it applies to everything. That's a mantra that I, start off as a lawyer thinking, well, who needs to make this decision? But if you don't have the right people, if others are in charge, in power terms, making decisions really for others without consulting, without acknowledging, without involving them, without their say-so, those are generally poor decisions. The latest statistics from the World Economic Forum are saying that actually it will be 136 years before we get to gender parity. It's actually got worse as a result of COVID, because the figure was 100 years and it's now 36 years more. We have to become even more savvy in terms of making sure that our political leaders understand the need for gender equality and act on it.
When more women are elected to Parliament, stronger environmental bills are passed and they're enforced more strongly, more strictly. There is some clear correlation there, and without it, we're not going to make the critical changes and implement the critical solutions that we need to solve the climate crisis. I think the more we just see women owning what it is that they do, that's what changes the conversation, rather than these platitudes of people discussing, so we're going to talk about female representation in academia or female representation in politics. I think having key women there who are ready to set an example, be role models and open the door for others as they come through, that's what's motivating.
I would say focus on the 5 Fs. So food, fashion, finance, fuel, and friendships and community. So actually, if you look at all aspects of climate are covered in those categories, and we can relate to them a bit more than if we just talk about climate change in terms of the energy sector or the transport sector or the agricultural sector. Those are quite technical ways of looking at how climate impacts our lives every day. Women are completely at the forefront of climate solutions in everyday life. Our life is dominated by food, by finance, And finally, fashion, which is, almost always seen as a gendered, issue affecting women disproportionately. A huge sector in terms of its global emissions, huge supply chains, from cotton to leather to disposable fashion, which is now, being shipped off, mainly going to landfill. Most of our clothes end up in landfill after a handful of uses.
Fashion is very much about all of us. The majority, I think, the great majority of the population wears clothes. And this is an industry with huge ramifications, both socially and environmentally. This is an industry that is primarily bought by women. It is an industry that starts from female hand. When we look at its history, it's an industry that's been hijacked from us and turned from industriousness and dignity into growth for growth's sake and exploitation of us first. That we believe in a fashion industry that restores and conserves the environment and values people over profit and growth. So the importance that fashion has in redressing this balance, this imbalance, is vital, particularly for generations to come.
Women can also be solutions in these sectors. They can drive the demand, and as they take their positions, as designers, as titans of industry, as women in finance, they can become more conscious and instill change in their own sectors that they know from their own familiar life, from their lived experiences, matter a lot.
I don't think the connections have been made as strongly as they need to be in the minds of everyone that operates in the finance sector, that gender equality is really good for planetary health. The more we push gender equality in finance, the more we're going to get the kind of rapid acceleration of attention to ecological challenges and finance really doing its bit to restore planetary security. The way we're running things today just isn't sustainable. We really cannot fix those things without fixing finance. And part of the answer to that is actually having gender-balanced decision-making at every layer and in every part of the finance community. This isn't a fight that can only be fought by women. It absolutely needs to be men and women coming together, both to ensure we have gender-balanced leadership across the world in all the key settings, but particularly in the settings that matter for the climate.
In a word, it's JEDI, justice, equality, diversity and inclusion, are the solutions to climate by acting on inequalities, by protecting the vulnerable, by protecting the planet, as well as communities who are currently not, participating and not being heard. That's how you solve the climate crisis, which is basically a crisis of governance and of deficits in protecting and supporting the full range of people on the planet.
At COP26, we saw over 100 Amazonian indigenous leaders were there, and there were people from all over the world who were indigenous. The oil industry had over 500 lobbyists there. A lot of the indigenous women didn't actually have access to come inside the summit. They were in the streets, they were in the forums, outside. There were commitments made to indigenous people at COP. Several billions were pledged to support indigenous peoples. We haven't seen that money yet, and so we're going to be looking for that and holding those who made those commitments to task for delivering on those commitments. We're basically a few years, at most 10, but as little as 3 years away from what scientists call a tipping point of no return, where the forest can no longer recirculate enough rain to be a rainforest and starts to become a savanna. After that threshold is crossed, over the next 50 to 70 years, we could see the loss of the majority of the Amazon rainforest. People aren't realizing that where we are, we're at the edge of the cliff. Once we go off the cliff, we cannot get back on the cliff. We're there now. We're basically at tipping point. So our actions need to commensurate with the scale of the problems we're facing.
Join a movement, pester politicians, demand accountability and action, because it's a huge systemic issue.
Of course, some people have more responsibility than others. Governments have a huge amount of responsibility. Major corporations and the wealthy have huge responsibility, as well as the media. We all share in this responsibility, but there are some of us who can do more than others.
what will happen if we don't achieve gender equality? You just have such a diminishing of the talents of everyone, and it is, at the end of the day, an abuse of human rights to not allow everyone to flourish to their full capacities based on gender differences.
We need to acknowledge that women absolutely have a vital role to play in leadership roles relating to the climate crisis.
When it is to be seated at the table of negotiation, when it really matters, well, they are still not there.
If you exclude or diminish or don't recognise the contribution of half of the planet, you are not going to get the best solutions. You're not going to get them taken up at speed. You're not going to get them implemented fast enough.
Not all solutions are going to need the same people. And by having this sort of fluidity, we're much more able to make quicker change and actually more impactful change.
We see the solutions, we know what needs to be done. We need the political will, we need the capital, and we need the urgency to know we're at the edge of the cliff. I still have hope that we will wake up and see that, because the alternative is unthinkable.